Everyone, and welcome to today's webinar. I'm Gregory Young, Program Manager with the Clean Coalition. We're very excited today to host this webinar on a market mechanism developed by the Clean Coalition called the Resilient Energy Subscription, which is a new way to ensure energy resilience while proliferating clean local energy. Before we go into this, a few housekeeping items. We will be emailing everyone this webinar recording and slides within a couple business days. Also, all of our webinars are archived on our website, clean-coalition.org, under events. If you have any questions at any time during the webinar, please go ahead and type them into the question pane on the right-hand side of the screen. You'll see this on the slide shown here. We will answer as many questions as we can during the Q&A, which will follow the presentation. Also, if you have any questions about the Clean Coalition, you can contact me at gregory@clean-coalition.org. Now I'm going to provide a brief overview of the Clean Coalition and to set some grounding for today's webinar. Clean Coalition's mission is to accelerate the transition to renewable energy and a modern grid through technical, policy, and project development expertise. We see a 100% renewable energy endgame in which 25% is local, interconnected within the distribution grid, and 75% is remote, dependent on the transmission grid. Secondly, the Clean Coalition defines microgrids in 4 ways. A microgrid is a combination of, a simple microgrid is a combination of energy resources, definitively including generation and storage, that are coordinated to serve specific loads, including in an islanded fashion. A solar microgrid, though, is behind-the-meter microgrid that solely relies on solar for energy generation when islanded. A hybrid solar microgrid is a solar microgrid that includes additional sources of energy generation beyond just solar, such as diesel, for example. A community microgrid is a microgrid that covers a target grid area and relies on existing distribution feeders to operate when islanded. Community microgrids typically include both front-of-the-meter and behind-the-meter resources, including solar microgrids, and require effective participation from utilities, which have mostly erected barriers to date. Now I'm going to introduce our presenter for today. We have Benjamin Schwartz, who is a policy manager of the Clean Coalition. He's been working for us for many years now, and he is strictly responsible for all of the regulatory filings that are submitted to the California Public Utilities Commission, the CEC, and beyond. Ben, I'm going to pass it over to you now, and look for you to kick it off.
Great, thank you so much, Gregory. So to start, community microgrids are slowly beginning to be deployed across California. Albeit, it leaves much to be desired, at least for the pace. The ribbon cutting that happened earlier this year for the Redwood Coast Airport microgrid, RCAM, represented a major step forward in creating the partnerships and the materials necessary to increase the pace of deployments of community microgrids. However, roadblocks still exist when it comes to traditional utility business models, interconnection concerns, precise operating and liability agreements, and existing regulation, like the over-the-fence rule. This webinar on the Resilient Energy Subscription, or RES, will discuss the pathway for deploying a community microgrid in California and describe a market mechanism that addresses the business model portion of the community microgrid question. To start, establishing a community microgrid requires 3 steps that we can call the 3 E's: establish, enhance, and expand. The first is how to establish the initial footprint of the community microgrid to provide resilience to critical facilities that the microgrid is designed around. The second is, after providing resilience for those critical facilities, how to enhance the community microgrid by offering resilience to a greater number of facilities within that initial footprint. And once that has been completed, the third step is how and where to expand the community microgrid so resilience benefits can be extended to a greater number of critical facilities and other facilities throughout the community. Next slide, please. Great. The Resilient Energy Subscription, RES, is a straightforward fee-based market mechanism that finances the enhancement and expansion of a community microgrid via a guaranteed delivery of local energy for all ratepayers that sign the contract. During grid outages, facilities that subscribe under a RES contract by paying a simple $1 per kilowatt hour fee on top of the normal rate tariff, these facilities will receive a guaranteed daily delivery of energy to cover critical loads. The RES fee ensures that all ratepayers within the footprint of the community microgrid have access to resilience and can choose how much energy to pay for in order to achieve that resilience. I just want to note, under normal grid conditions, facilities that subscribe to RES will receive as much energy as they require. However, RES kicks in the event of an outage, where facilities that subscribe will receive at the very least the contracted amount of RES energy. However, if there is extra energy available beyond any RES allocations, it will be distributed amongst facilities by the distribution operator or the community microgrid operator. Now, it is in the interest of the community microgrid operator to deliver energy as long as it is available, and for the utility as well, since all excess energy will be sold under the normally applicable rate tariff, meaning that RES will mean less losses of sales than during a normal grid outage. And for the facility deploying, expanding, and operating the community microgrid, the RES fees will be based on the appropriate cost of service of the microgrid and will allow the developer to recover CapEx and OpEx spending, including operations and maintenance costs, as well as an appropriate rate of return. And just to summarize, since I went through a lot there, facilities can opt into resilience under the RES through a contract with the utility microgrid operator. Now, this is a $1 per kilowatt hour per month fee for reserving local energy, and it's based on the number of daily kilowatt hours a facility wants to reserve. And this will be an additional expense on top of the normal cost of energy. Next slide. Okay, so the value of resilience methodology that forms the basis for RES. Next slide. While the cost of service is appropriate for pricing the RES fee, prospective customers will want an easy way to determine the value of resilience and figure out how much they should reserve using their RES fee. The Clean Coalition has developed such a methodology, which we call VOR 123, 123 for the different load tierings. VOR 123 makes it possible to quantify renewables-driven resilience at any facility in any location. The key is tiering different loads because different loads have different resilience values. Next slide. Specifically, the Clean Coalition's VOR 123 divides electric loads at a facility into 3 distinct types. Tier 1, in the green seen in this graph, are mission critical loads that generally make up 10% of the total load and can be something necessary for the functionality of the facility along the lines of refrigeration loads or sustaining electricity for medical baseline customers. Tier 2 loads are priority loads, which usually make up about 15% of the total load. And in total, Tier 1 and Tier 2 loads make up 25%, whereas the remaining 75% are Tier 3 loads, which are discretionary loads that are only kept on when doing so does not threaten Tier 1 and Tier 2 resilience. So, this percentage can be slightly different depending on every facility. For a critical facility like a hospital, the Tier 1 loads could be around 50%, whereas for a general house like my house, the Tier 1 loads would only be the refrigeration, and the Tier 2 loads could be anything necessary for communication, a router and modem to keep Wi-Fi on, and a few plug loads as well. And I'd just like to note that VOR123 is a normalized methodology for any facility in any geography. However, every facility will be slightly different depending on the geography, which will have a unique solar resource quality. But the most important thing to consider is that those tier 1 loads, the mission critical loads, are what will impact the sizing of the battery in a community microgrid. Next slide. Great. This is a specific scenario, is a graphical view of what the value of resilience looks like for a solar microgrid designed for the University of California, Santa Barbara, UCSB. In the area, there's a lot of fog on the coastline, so the solar quality is not quite as good as if you were 5 miles inland. However, if the project is net zeroed and there's around 2 times the amount of storage that there is solar, which is a typical sizing for clean coalition projects, we end up with the scenario represented by this graph. The x-axis of the graph represents percentage of time that a load stays online, and the y-axis represents the percentage of load that can be kept online. So, as can be seen, tier 1 loads, which are 10% of the total load, can be kept on 100% of the time, and tier 2 loads will be kept on whenever possible, which is generally around 80% of the time. Next slide. In this version of the graph, the key is the red box in the bottom left corner, which demonstrates the resilience that a typical diesel generator can provide as compared with renewables-driven backup power. What we find is that a typical diesel generator has enough diesel fuel on site to supply those tier 1, tier 2 loads, 25% of the load, for about 2 days. But if the generator cannot be resupplied in the event of a longer term outage, the diesel generator will be obviated after those 2 days, whereas a community microgrid would continue to provide backup power to the most critical loads indefinitely. And while the Clean Coalition normally advocates for solar and storage-driven microgrids, for hybrid microgrids, the solar and storage can lessen the need for the dirty diesel generator. Next slide. Based on this tiering system, which is VOR123, the Clean Coalition has determined that an appropriate VOR123 adder is about 25% for a typical facility. And by the way, there is a lot of information about this on the Clean Coalition website, so I will be going through it relatively quickly. So the question is, what does 25% mean? If a facility, for example, is paying $100,000 per year on electricity costs, they should be willing to pay $125,000 for electricity and resilience. And the Clean Coalition has validated this approach using 4 different methods: a cost of service approach, a market-based approach, an avoided diesel generator approach, as well as consulting the existing Department of Energy multiplier. Now, without a value of resilience, whenever we go to a facility and ask, is there a price for indefinite renewables-driven resilience? The answer is undoubtedly yes, but when we ask the follow-up question, how much is resilience worth, or what are you willing to pay for that resilience, we're usually met with silence, which comes down to $0 in actual calculations. Therefore, the Clean Coalition's validation that 25% is the appropriate adder for resilience is an important step towards valuing all of the services that a microgrid provides. Now, let's apply this to the solar microgrids contracted by Santa Barbara Unified School District as an example. You can see the chart below. I'll be referring to this example a few times, so it's good to familiarize yourself with it. Over the lifetime of the power purchase agreements, the district will realize significant savings in the form of lower energy bills, around $8 million, which is the teal column, as well as millions of dollars in the value of resilience benefits for free, and that is the brown column. Next slide. view R123 for a community microgrid. So now that we've discussed the value of resilience for individual facilities, the question is how to apply that value to a larger grid area. And what we've found is that the same VOR123 principles for individual facilities can also be applied to larger grid areas. In other words, it is possible to tier facilities within a section of the distribution grid based on their societal value. Each facility can be ranked 1 through 3, and the individual loads within each facility can also be ranked 1 through 3, which is how we get this graphic. And as we look at this graphic, the most important level of resilience would be for tier 1 loads at tier 1 facilities, which can be seen in the dark green box. And as we'll discuss later, the importance of loads and facilities determines how much that facility should pay to receive resilience. Next slide. The primary emphasis of a community microgrid should be providing 100% resilience for all tier 1 loads at tier 1 facilities. These are types of facilities that could include fire stations, emergency shelter sites, and can also include grocery stores, assisted living facilities, pharmacies, gas stations, and EV charging stations, among others. Now, the second emphasis should be providing resilience for tier 1 loads at tier 2 facilities and tier 2 loads at tier 1 facilities. And these are the 2 lighter green squares. In terms of importance, the yellow boxes and gray boxes should only ever be maintained if there is A, excess energy, or B, a RES subscription paid for by an individual ratepayer, since these are loads that do not have the same societal value as tier 1 loads do. Next slide. Financing community microgrids and their expansion with RES. Keep going. Okay. Due to the critical and societal roles that tier 1 facilities play in a community, the cost of service for providing resilience for all tier 1 loads at tier 1 facilities should be socialized. The current cost of service approach already recovers infrastructure costs for the distribution and transmission grid from all ratepayers within a utility service territory. Including the cost of resilience for the most critical loads at critical facilities in the price of the RES fee serves as an incentive for the critical facilities to deploy community microgrids, as well as to expand them outwards to include additional facilities that will benefit from a resilient community. Community microgrids have enough revenue streams that investments made in resilience at critical facilities will be more than recovered over time. And if there's enough revenue due to grid services being fully valued or additional incentives or some other form of revenue, ideally the cost of service of providing resilience for the light green squares, tier 2 loads at tier 1 facilities, and tier 1 loads at tier 2 facilities can be rate-based as well. Next slide. RES allows utilities to strategically plan for resilience by aggregating the total RES allocations as they're contracted by facilities throughout the footprint of the community microgrid. This means that simple market forces will determine when and where it is viable to enhance the community microgrid and expand it to encompass additional facilities. As the community microgrid expands, costs and fees will be reduced, and RES fees will be recalculated monthly to account for additional subscribers. This is similar to what is currently done for transmission and distribution charges. Next slide. The cost of service for expanding a community microgrid via RES. Once an initial community microgrid is established to serve critical facilities, the incremental cost of service for serving additional facilities will be low. This graph of a linear function is a representation of what we call the 1% for 1% rule for RES financing. In other words, for each 1% of the facility that, for each 1% of the load rather, that a facility secures via RES, the electric bill will rise by an additional 1%. The two dotted lines that can be seen, or the two dotted points of intersection, represent the different tiers of resilience. So the first one at 10% of the load represents tier 1 loads and will increase the electric bill by an additional 10%, whereas the tier 2 loads, which are an additional 15%, will increase the bill by 15%. So to provide resilience for tier 1 and tier 2 loads, which can be seen as 25%, that second point of intersection, the total increase for the electric bill should be expected to be an additional 25%. Next slide. How RES works for subscribed facilities. And keep going, there we go. So it is important to note that under normal grid conditions, subscribed facilities will be able to operate with all loads served, and there's no limit to the amount of energy that can be imported from the grid. The RES allocation specifically deals with grid outage scenarios, in which case facilities will at minimum receive the allocation they contracted for, and in many cases will receive more than this minimum, given the microgrid operator's incentive to sell as much energy as possible. Next slide. All right, sizing RES for a specific facility. For individual facilities, it is important to determine what is the most cost-effective usage of a RES allocation. And to do this, a facility can either A, use the VOR 123 methodology to assess general load tiering percentages, or B, use empirical data from past grid outages in the region and past meter data in order to determine the facility's appetite for RES energy. Next slide. Okay, facilities with existing solar that are subscribed to RES. For facilities with existing solar, there is an additional benefit to subscribing to RES. First, it will ensure that when the rest of the non-subscriber meters are turned off, RES facilities will maintain electrical service. And this is important because during grid outages, normally facilities with solar only will turn off and cannot self-generate. However, when considering the example of the Santa Barbara Unified School District in the map below, while the microgrid sites will island and continue to function in grid outage scenarios, locations that chose to deploy PV only will remain online if a RES contract is in place. And for those sites, because the PV will continue to function during the outage, the generation will cover at least a portion of the resilience need, which reduces the amount of energy that needs to be reserved through RES. Alternatively, the schools could choose to export all generation during the outage to make money. Next slide. Analyzing RES feasibility for community microgrid owner operators and subscribed facilities. The important question when considering RES feasibility is RES feasible for both community microgrid owner operators and subscribed facilities? Now, for the subscribers, the key is guaranteeing that locally generated energy will be delivered in all grid conditions at a value appropriate rate. And for the community microgrid owner operators, the income that comes from the aggregated RES fees will cover the cost of service of the microgrid and also ensure a positive rate of return. I'd just like to note that a community microgrid should always be a mutually beneficial technology. So only if the answer to this important question is yes for both parties, then there's a cost-effective reason to deploy a community microgrid as a resilience solution. Next slide. Great. So res feasibility from the subscriber perspective. So for the subscriber, affordability is defined in terms of percentage increase in the subscriber's electricity bill per the percentage of subscriber load guaranteed by the res, which can be visualized based off of the following ratio seen in green: percentage of bill increase divided by percentage of load guaranteed is equal to the res fee in dollars per kilowatt divided by the electricity bill blended rate. And the Clean Coalition analysis has shown that a res fee of 20 cents per kilowatt hour is feasible, and a typical energy rate is around the same amount, that same 20 cents per kilowatt hour, which yields a ratio of 1%. And the closer that ratio is to 1%, the better the economics will be. And it's important to note that these res fees will be recalculated each month. So even if the initial ratio does not start at 1.0, it will trend that way as the microgrid is enhanced and expanded. Next slide. Okay, res subscriber backing up 10% of the load. So revisiting this graph that we saw earlier, it is clear that the linear nature of the 1% rule, 1 for 1% rule, can be applied in all resilience situations. And based on these points of intersection, the dotted lines, a guaranteed delivery of energy that covers tier 1 and tier 2 loads will cost 25% increase on the total electricity bill. But let's take an example of a subscriber that just wants to back up those tier 1 loads. Say that facility has a total daily load appetite of 30 kilowatt hours. In that case, tier 1 resilience, which is 10% of the load, is determined to be 3 kilowatt hours. Therefore, an appropriate res contract would guarantee a minimum delivery of 3 kilowatt hours per day in the event of a grid outage. Next slide. All right, res feasibility from the perspective of the community microgrid owner operator. Now, for the community microgrid owner operator, which the Clean Coalition has not specified who should fill this role. It could be a third party or it could be the utility. However, the importance here is the return on equity, which depends on a few factors: the cash inflows, which are the aggregated res fees, energy that's sold to the utility, as well as financial incentives from energy storage and generation, versus the cash outflows, which are CapEx and OpEx costs. The key to resilience for long duration outages is properly sizing the energy storage so that it is large enough to maintain the critical loads. So it is important to add incremental storage as the microgrid expands, as well as planning for battery replacement at the appropriate years in the financial planning. Next slide. Okay, so the next 2 slides I will be going through pretty quickly, since the specific financials are less important to dive into now than the general requirements that make res feasible. This chart shows the investments necessary to deploy a community microgrid and the energy sales that will come from a microgrid. Note the costs for the microgrid hardware and MC squared, which stands for microgrid controls, monitoring, communications, and controls include behind the meter load management, advanced metering infrastructure, AMI, grid isolation switches, and a DERMS, a distributed energy resources management system. This chart is the version of the community microgrid. Next slide, apologies. Now, this chart is the version of the community microgrid cash inflow and outflow. While the majority of the investment is upfront, which can be seen in the left, the operations and maintenance costs are only around $27,000, whereas the annual revenue from res is $165,000. And the revenue from energy sales will bring an additional $236,000. Now, because the revenue from energy sales and res is much larger than the OPEX costs, res is worthwhile. So it won't be long until the system starts seeing a positive return on investment. And when factoring in all costs, including energy replacement, the community microgrid should see an internal rate of return of at least 9%. 9% is a significant rate of return that should be appetizing to the microgrid owner and operator, given that investments in distribution assets normally net an 8% rate of return. Res provides a greater opportunity for profit. Next slide. Okay, this is the Grand Orcas Community Microgrid Plan. So in addition to the modeling that the Clean Coalition conducted to verify the RES methodology, we are also working with a utility in northern Washington called Apalco, or the Orcas Power and Light Cooperative, to implement the RES as part of a community microgrid deployment there. Apalco operates the grid at 20 islands on this archipelago called the San Juan Islands. The rest of the islands don't have electricity, so they're not relevant to this community microgrid. And currently, we're focusing on Orcas Island, which is highlighted in blue. It looks like a horseshoe on this map, and it's one of the largest islands on the archipelago. Next slide. The initial staging area for the community microgrid will be in East Sound, which is on Orcas Island. And this is a drilled down view of the island. We have begun to identify critical facilities that will be included in the initial microgrid footprint, as well as generation sources. In this map, everything shaded in a color is a critical facility. And these are all critical facilities that have been identified, so we can provide high levels of resilience during the initial deployment of the microgrid. Next slide. Everything that I just showed on the last view is in that little orange polygon, which kind of looks like a tipped over T. This map shows the boundaries of where the initial deployment of the community microgrid will be, along with the existing switchgear and new grid isolation switches that will need to be added. Because the solar quality is low in Washington, much lower than it is here in California, the community microgrid will also include a biopower facility sited to the south. You can see the icon with the lightning bolt within a triangle to represent it. And so when the broader grid goes down and the microgrid goes into an islanded mode, 100% of that biopower will be exported to East Sound to benefit the microgrid customers. And next slide. Okay, so the RES feasibility analysis results. So just to summarize, Clean Coalition analysis has shown that a subscription ratio of 1%, that is 1% bill increase per 1% guaranteed load coverage, is value appropriate for subscribers. And for the community microgrid owner operators, a positive internal rate of return of 9% is quite feasible, making the RES cost effective for all stakeholders. And the key is that it is feasible for all stakeholders before a community microgrid is planned and deployed. And with that, I will say thank you, and I'm happy to answer any questions that you might have.
Great. Thank you so much, Ben. Very enlightening. So now that we've reached the point in our webinar where we have entered Q&A. So if you have input, any questions in the Q&A tab, taskbar on the right-hand side, great. We're going to be going through those now. If you haven't, please do so, and we'll get to them, as we go through them. So it looks like we have, a few questions right now that have come in throughout the webinar. I'll just go through those first. So a Patrick Carter, asks, who would be financing RES subscriptions? utilities, municipalities, solar, battery developers. I believe Ben, you answered that, but feel free to go ahead and provide some more insight.
Yeah, thanks. So I think the key here is that the Clean Coalition at this point is kind of agnostic to who develops and owns the microgrid and finances it. It's set up in such a way that it could be any of the entities that you mentioned. Currently in California, the only way that community microgrids are allowed is if the incumbent utility continues to use and operate its own distribution grid. So that's kind of a sticking point. So, we definitely see scenarios where either the utility owns or operates the microgrid, or a developer owns and operates the microgrid in an islanded mode, and the utility owns the microgrid in normal grid conditions. I think the key is that, regardless of who owns and operates it, the rate of return and financial incentives of keeping the power on in all conditions should be appetizing to all parties involved.
Great. Yeah, awesome. Thank you, Ben. I'm going to move on to the next question. So George Wilsey asks, or actually states first, a good point about the limited value and dirty exhaust of backup diesel gensets. Then he goes ahead and asks, please comment on the possibility of using fuel cells to serve this same function. And then he says, with fuel cells, natural gas is not the only fuel that could be provided to maximize resilience and minimizing fuel use and dirty exhaust. For example, stored hydrogen could be made available for longer than 2 days.
Yeah, so that's a very good point. Clean Coalition microgrids are primarily designed using solar and storage. So whenever there is a solar quality that's high enough, I'd say that is our preference to create dispatchable energy, which is the point of a fuel cell as well. And a fuel cell is certainly a better resource than a polluting diesel generator. So I think we are definitely open to including those in community microgrids as well. The more distributed energy resources there are, the better. But in many cases, unless it's absolutely necessary, I think the Clean Coalition tries solar plus storage first. But I will say that for some loads that will always stay on, for example, I discussed a hospital that has a higher percentage of critical loads. A fuel cell that can constantly serve those loads could be a good alternative, especially as you mentioned, if there are higher percentages of hydrogen.
All right. See here, Jacqueline Baum asks, does the 25% VOR adder consider baseline resilience, reliability metrics met by the local utility, i.e., have you seen the VOR vary, the value of resilience vary in regions with lower than average reliability?
Yeah, so our value of resilience is not done from the utility perspective, which considers things like SAIDI and the average frequency of outages. It's more considering it from the perspective of the facilities. So I would say for places where there are reliability issues, having a microgrid that can ensure power will be beneficial, and if it can provide reliability as well, that would be another important form of revenue. But since the perspective is from that of the facilities, it allows each facility the choice to determine what their own resilience metrics are. And I think that's the key there, rather than focusing on it from the utility perspective. It's more of a social burden metric than it is a facet of the effectiveness of the grid.
Okay. See here, next question. So Richard McCann, did I pronounce that correctly? Apologies if I didn't. McCann. The financials show a sales price to the utility at 10 cents a kilowatt hour. What's the basis of that assumption? Is that price already established in a tariff?
Yeah, so what we did when modeling this is considered different tariffs and an appropriate value of solar. And while the value is a little bit low, what we ended up using is modeling it based on a remat price for solar, and then extrapolating that further with the various community microgrid expenses. So that's the basis for solar. Obviously, if you have another resource, another rate schedule might be more applicable. But this was our initial analysis, given that the focus is solar and storage.
Okay. Again, tricky last name, Abora Akol, I believe that's how you pronounce it, asks, did you consider energy arbitrage returns as part of the IRR calculations?
Yeah, so I think that they can be, but they are not, the main priority of the resilience. In one of the slides, I mentioned, the importance of sizing the battery correctly. And if you are doing that for resilience, regardless of how much solar is being received, there needs to be a minimum state of charge in order to ensure that those critical loads have the resilience they need. And so it's possible to do energy arbitrage to a certain degree, as long as that minimum state of charge is always available, should a grid outage occur at any given time.
Great. So your next question, Alice Sung asks, would utilities that build these have to include in their rate case? Are tier 3 loads potentially unregulated businesses?
So that's a good question. And to be perfectly honest, I'm not sure to what extent a utility would have to include it in a rate case. I think it depends on who is funding the project and who is operating the community microgrid as well. If it is a resilient investment that is known and planned up front, potentially as part of the grid needs assessment and DIDIF framework, it may need to be included in the rate case. But if it is initially deployed by a third party, perhaps not. And while I hadn't thought about tier 3 loads as being unregulated businesses, I don't necessarily think that I would categorize it as that, considering under normal grid outages, that there is no option for businesses at this point unless they've got individual microgrids. So I think it's more like giving these facilities that are within the footprint of a community microgrid the agency to choose what level of resilience they want and determine that based on their appetite and willingness to pay.
Awesome. We have another question here. If a community microgrid owner were willing to take less than 9% IRR, could the value appropriate res subscription take of 1% bill increase be decreased as well?
Yeah, so that's a really good question. I think the answer to that is yes, and it also kind of changes as the different incentives and value streams change as well. So our analysis was done before the Inflation Reduction Act was passed, which will certainly change some of the economics. But if the operator were willing to go down to 8%, which is what distribution assets, the return on equity for those is at, it potentially could reduce the 1% for 1% rule, as well as if the community microgrid were further scaled and the number of ratepayers within the footprint of the community microgrid and subscribing to RES increased as well. So I think the key is that 1% is the ideal. It likely will not be reached at first, but certainly as more subscribers are added, it will trend downwards and could trend below 1% given certain situations.
Cool. Okay, let's see here. Next question from Stuart Highland. What do you mean by islanded fashion? Does microgrid creation require local government approval, such as a business license, etc.? He lives in California, he says.
Yeah, so what I say when I mean islanded is in the event of a grid outage, the microgrid would be able to island from the rest of the grid, meaning that it would continue to function with power on, even if the rest of the grid was in an outage scenario. And one of the slides that the Clean Coalition usually uses when describing community microgrids, although I didn't hear, is kind of a circle that shows 8 or 9 different groups of stakeholders, and the utilities are one and local governments are also one. So there's no way of doing a large-scale community microgrid without the approval and buy-in of each of those different groups of stakeholders. So without a doubt, a large-scale project like a community microgrid would go to the local Board of Supervisors or City Council, depending on the municipality. And given that a community microgrid, specifically in the fashion that is being discussed here, are going to be planned and deployed around critical community facilities, working with the community and those community leaders, I think, would be one of the only ways to successfully deploy a community microgrid.
Okay. All right, next question. Let's see here. Got one. States, what is a non-res microgrid? I'm not sure how you can best answer that one, Ben.
Yeah, that's a really good question. So currently, if we take the example of RCAM, which is the Redwood Coast Airport Microgrid, and that is one of, if not the first community microgrid that's been deployed in California. It's currently a partnership between the Redwood Coast Energy Authority, which has some of the customers in the microgrid, PG&E, which has other customers in the microgrid, and the California Energy Commission. And the way that they were able to make that microgrid work is with that partnership, as well as significant funding from the California Energy Commission. And so, in that case, they still have not figured out the full business model, because the community microgrid was only deployable due to having that grant funding. And, some of the portions of the business model, like how to value resilience, have not yet been considered. So what RES does is it takes those question marks of what revenue streams do you need to make a community microgrid work, and it simplifies them by allowing each facility to choose its own level of resilience and pay for that appropriately, rather than receiving that for free, as was the case for some facilities in the Redwood Coast Airport microgrid, considering that the primary critical facility and the reason that microgrid was deployed is the airport. So other facilities on the same feeder did not have to pay for getting that resilience. But in normal situations, if the project were not a demonstration project, essentially, having some facilities pay and others not would be seen as a cost shift. So what RES is it's a way to include all of those revenue streams and figure out, what is the remaining portion that needs to be there to finance the community microgrid, and how to make sure that all communities that receive resilience benefits are paying their fair share.
Awesome. Okay. Next question. So it looks like we have a question from John Borland again. So within the community microgrid, how do you separate power between homes and other critical dwellings next to each?
Yeah, thanks for this question. This is actually one of the things that I didn't cover, and this is going to the more technical aspect of how would you actually, achieve in community microgrid from the configuration standpoint. And when discussing this, what we, decided on is that with the transition in California to smart meters that have better, communications with the grid and send signals at an increased pace, we would use those as leverage to turn on and off different homes. So let's take a normal grid outage condition, right? In a normal grid outage, all homes are turned off completely. And once the broader grid is turned back on, only at that point are individual meters on a feeder turned back on. So the utilities currently have capabilities to do what are called remote shutoffs. They do this when they're turning on and off the power for a new ratepayer or customer at a new facility. And so ideally, a community microgrid deployed with RES will be able to turn off all the meters for non-subscribers and ensure that the meters for RES subscribers are turned on so they can receive their RES allocation. And we've spoken to the utilities about this. While they don't feel entirely comfortable using this as a technical mechanism, remote shutoffs, they generally say this because they envision having 100% success as necessary before they roll out these remote shutoffs and disconnections as a tool that can be used. So based on their confidence, we feel that it's more than possible using current technology to achieve a successful islanding and disconnection process for some of the customers on feeder, but not all.
Great, awesome. Tying into that a little bit, but reiterating, maybe potentially something you touched earlier, but J. Powell asks, what about CCAs being the owner operators of these microgrids? And then he mentions using municipal facilities as the nodes.
Yeah, I think that would be a very good idea, considering that CCAs already provide the energy for their customers. So, in my mind, that's a fit that makes a lot of sense. I think that the key is getting the utility buy-in, and CCAs are positioned well, in fact, much better than individual municipalities in having those dialogues and with the type of liability that comes from procuring a resource for customers. So in our mind, CCAs would not only be a good partner, they would really be primed as owner operators for community microgrids. And we'd love to see or work with interested CCAs in trying to figure out what a RES energy program would look like for different facilities and different CCAs.
Cool. So yeah, questions keep piling in, so we're going to keep going. See here, James Dodinoff asks, have you developed a similar $ per kilowatt hour for backup power from diesel generators? Then he said, I'd argue that diesel backup is not 100% reliable by any stretch.
Yeah, so we'd certainly agree with you there. And we often talk about the time that it takes to resupply diesel and to fix the natural gas system if it were to go down. We have not developed a specific diesel $ per kilowatt number that I can give you off the top of my head. What we did do, however, is validate the VOR123, the Clean Coalition's value of resilience methodology against what it would cost for resilience if a facility were using a diesel generator as opposed to a solar microgrid. So in some ways we have considered that, and it is included in the 25% VOR123 adder that I discussed earlier in the webinar.
Okay, let's see here, next question. So Giselle De Grandes states, would utilities that build these have to include in their next rate case? Are tier 3 loads potentially unregulated businesses? So she might have asked a similar question there.
Yeah, I think we covered this question a little bit, but it depends on who has the role of the owner versus the operator. And I think as long as there are specific contracts in place that really differentiate between those roles, and there are ironclad agreements for islanding the microgrid operation as well as who holds the liability, it might not be necessary to include that in a general rate case. But I think that more importantly, the concept of RES is a type of business model that would be very effective in a community microgrid tariff. And when the commission passes a community microgrid tariff, I think the way that the microgrids are deployed via that tariff in some ways will determine the answer to that question.
See here, so we got a couple questions from Bert Wink. He says, will these forced to be, let me just put some words between, I believe he mentioned here, he left out. So will these be forced to be grid connected by law? Which jurisdiction or off-grid islanded?
Yeah, so honestly, I think that the business model itself could work for grid connected and non-grid connected community microgrids. I think that's less of an issue with RES and more of an issue with existing grid regulations and the difficulty of making off-grid facilities. Obviously, if you have an off-grid facility, the microgrid would be unable to utilize any of the existing distribution grid. So, that adds extra costs for private lines. So generally, more often than not, I should say, the community microgrids will be grid tied, given the current setup of our grid. And, that presents its own issues with using public infrastructure, which is why it would be important to have the utility as a partner.
Okay, and then the last few questions we have come from Alice Sung. I'm just going to go through them one by one, Ben. You can respond back. So first one, what is the rate of electricity used to sell back to the grid, and what was the cost of electricity used in the purchasing of electricity?
So yeah, I believe we used a remat rate for sales to the grid. It would change slightly if that we're just using wholesale energy, and it depends on it. As for the energy being sold to the utility, it depends on the otherwise applicable tariff. So for some of the resources, if they were deployed behind the meter, that could be a NEM tariff. For other in front of the meter deployments, that could be a WDAT tariff. In general, I don't think it's easy to answer that question. I think we made some of both of those assumptions, but it really depends on the community microgrid itself. So in other words, the specific calculations of the RES fee and that ratio will change depending on the type and scale of resources being deployed, but it still should approach that 1.0 ratio.
Okay. Excellent. So yeah, her next question then goes, what is the relationship of IRR to RES subscription? What is the relationship of IRR to RES subscription ratio in your calcs? Can you share your formula with the variables involved?
Yeah, so what we did is we inputted all of the specific inflows and outflows, and took a look at the ratio based on those numbers, and then after all that was concluded, added in what we considered to be a more than generous rate of return. So the specific IRR is irrespective of the subscribers in that ratio, but it is included it is included in the cash inflows and outflows that will be calculated in the res fee. I hope that answers the question rather than confusing you a little more.
Yeah, no worries. So that actually speaks to, so if there are any questions that audience, if you guys have that come up, after the webinar, or maybe anything that didn't get answered along the way during the Q&A, you're welcome to reach out to myself, Gregory at clean-coalition.org, or Ben, which is Ben at clean-coalition.org. And we'll make sure to respond and fill in anything there. But that wraps up the Q&A in the webinar. So thank you everyone for taking the time today to sit down with us and listen to this exciting market mechanism that we have developed, and that the presentation that Ben has provided us. Have a great rest of your day.